We're going to get started. And thank you, Zach, for handling all of the filterings in. My name is Rebecca Lemon, and I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. Thank you so much for joining today for a conversation about Alaina Morgan's book, Atlantic Crescent, Building Geographies of Black and Muslim Liberation in the African Diaspora, which just appeared with UNC Press in 2025. So we invite everyone who is able to please turn on their camera. It just makes it a nicer occasion if we can see the faces of colleagues and friends who are here to support Alaina and her work. And it's really nice to see so many familiar faces too. So thank you. So joining us today are commentators Minkah Makalani, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you, Minkah. And Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, the Merle Curtis and Vilas Borghese Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So thank you, Jennifer, too. The conversation will be moderated by our colleague Taj Frazier, Associate Professor of Communication and Journalism and Director of the Institute for Difference and Empowerment in the Arts, which makes the nice acronym IDEA at USC. Today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Van Hunnick History Department, the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity, and the Black Studies Center. So we thank all three partners. Our program today is quite simple. We will start with a short introduction to the book by Alaina, and then she will be in conversation with Jennifer and Minkah for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. At that time, we will open the floor to questions from everyone. You will be able to ask questions by raising your Zoom hand, ideally. I know some of us are a little out of practice now that we're back to in person, most of the time, hopefully. So, Alaina, many congratulations on your wonderful book. It's so exciting that it is out in the world. So if you could please begin by telling us about it.
Always start off muted. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm so excited for your questions, for your provocations, and for all of your engagements. Since I know everybody's poured over the book, like I'll just stick to what Zach asked me to do and just only really briefly introduce kind of the characters, the argument, and also the chapter that I sent around for everybody to read. And so my book, Atlantic Crescent, argues that from World War I to the 1990s, Black people in the African diaspora used Islam to connect themselves together across the Atlantic Ocean. And in this way, they created a specifically Muslim Atlantic space, an imagined geographical space that I call the Atlantic Crescent. So hence the name of the book. And so I also have to just point out, right, the cover of the book, which I am obsessed with myself. I was adamant. I wanted the cover to reflect this concept. And I think the design department really pulled off an amazingly beautiful cover with the crescent and the intellectual frameworks that represent it, uniting the Atlantic Basin and all of the people. And so this crescent's a visual representation of the process by which the foundation was laid to create a general receptivity to Islam among Black people during this period. And I want to emphasize that as many Black people during this period frame it, right, that this is a reclamation of an indigenous religious tradition for African descended people in the Americas. They brought it with them in slave ships as they were forced to make the Middle Passage. It formed the basis of many resistance movements on ships and on plantations. And it was a formidable challenge to the discipline and submission of enslaved people. Eventually, right, it becomes little more than a memory by the beginning of the 20th century. And that's here that my story kind of begins. It's there in the still smoldering ashes of a Black Islamic tradition in the Americas that this new phoenix of Black Islamic practice arises. But something happens, right, that allows that phoenix to be reborn. And in weaving together the stories that are at the heart of Atlantic Crescent, I discovered that it was not just a Black American story, but a global story, a migration story, and a story that was very deeply connected to histories of empire. And so I argue that Islam was able to take root in Black communities in the 20th century because of a series of intersecting migrations that were precipitated by the violence and the economic destabilization created by World War I. And the one that immediately comes to mind is the Great Migration, right? The historic relocation of millions of African Americans from the southern United States to the North and the Midwest in the years during and after World War I. That transforms the character of American cities. And a lot of other scholars have argued that the Great Migration is the precipitator for the revival of Islam in Black communities. Of the, people when their hopes and their dreams were immigrating to the North with all these dreams of social mobility, financial success, freedom from racial violence, right? And as they're living in crowded tenements and struggling for employment, right, like they're searching for other alternatives to uplift them. And if Christianity is a failure for this, how then can they use other religious traditions like Islam, but also sometimes Judaism and other kind of a little quirkier, off the beaten path religions as well? But something was missing for me from this story. And then I remembered an article by the eminent historian, African American historian Earl Lewis, that suggested that the history of African American people should be examined as a history of overlapping diasporas. And so, taking that challenge up, I asked, what if we zoomed out and examined the Great Migration as not one, but as a series of global migrations during this period, all precipitated by the same global political and economic conditions, and all resulting in a series of overlapping diasporas and intersecting migrations, right? And so, by doing that, I was able to see some of the other characters that were less obvious in this story, like Afro-Caribbean migrants and South Asian migrants, right, that also populate the book's chapters. These people are all raised as Black, no matter where they originally came from, and they were living together in the same communities where they learned from each other, disagreed with each other, developed new strategies for survival. And one of those strategies was Islam. And so my subjects did a lot of work in these overlapping diasporas. They developed discourses, they deployed these frameworks, they disagreed with each other, they contradicted themselves often, right? And so the chapter that I had asked for everybody to read is chapter 4 of my manuscript, which is about Bermuda. And in that chapter, I explore the history of a community of Afro-Bermudian converts to Islam in the last half of the 20th century, and how their thinking and their actions surrounding Islam transformed over that period of time. And the history of Islam's survival in Bermuda, I argue, as the other vignettes in this book, is something that is forged in diaspora. The religion begins as a seed grabbed by an Afro-Bermudian man, stowing away on a commercial vessel to escape poverty, unemployment, and racial violence in Bermuda. After a false start, that seed's able to take root in Bermuda after technologies of communication transform the way that people consume information and news after World War II, and sparks Bermuda's civil rights movement. It's bolstered by newspapers smuggled through Atlantic cruise ship networks. Shared government surveillance sparks anxieties and condemnations from the United States and the British government. And most critically, right, it transforms and adapts to the unique circumstances of Bermudian life and politics. It's an example of how people built their own unique, particular Atlantic crescents from their own perspective. And so I'll leave it at that. And I'm really excited to talk about this more and some of the other examples in the book as well.
Thank you. That was such a helpful sense of your intervention, which will give us, I think, a lot to talk about. And first, we get to hear from Minkah about some comments leading to a question.
Yes, well, thank you to the Levan Institute for inviting me to participate. in this discussion. Alaina, nice to see you again. And thank you for the opportunity to go back over the work. And we've only met once, I think, or maybe you were a graduate student when we first met, but you came to Hopkins last year, and so we had a good conversation about the work. I don't remember if I ever mentioned, but one of the things that that really helped me gravitate and enjoy the work is kind of my own path, brief through Islam. I was raised in the Baptist church. I got sent to Catholic school, and then my family became Pentecostal, Church of God in Christ. And so to escape all of it for a brief moment, I flirted with the Nation of Islam, and then the 5% Nation of Gods and Earths. And um, so it's interesting to read your work to get a perspective on Black Islam more generally, a lot of which I did not know, and then the Nation of Islam in particular, which wasn't apparent to me as a 18-year-old trying to figure out my way in the world. So if I didn't say that when we met last year, I did want to say, I appreciated that for very personal reasons, as well as the obvious intellectual reasons that one would enjoy the book. So I just want to offer a couple of overarching remarks, observations, and then I want to pose a question to kind of get the conversation started. So obviously, if you've read just the one chapter, or if you've had the pleasure of reading the book, you will recognize that Atlantic Crescent is a beautifully written work of scholarship that situates the dynamic national and global dimensions of Black Islam at the center of an array of political problems that Black people encountered throughout the 20th century. Rather than follow the standard practice of viewing Black Muslims and Islamic practices as esoteric, heterodox, and thus illegitimate departures from Orthodox Islam, Alaina unravels a complex intellectual and political history of a religious practice that provided, quote, an anti-colonial and anti-imperial mechanism for people of African descent in the 20th century Atlantic world, which enabled them to imagine a program to, quote, remedy social ills and achieve racial and political freedom. To this end, she provides one of the more illuminating discussions of Black Islam, in particular, the Moorish Science Temple of America and the Nation of Islam, in the US and the Caribbean, excavating a dynamic, if still poorly understood story of Black Islamic practices serving as an African diasporic conduit for Black internationalism and radical politics. One thing Alaina does especially well is track multiple diasporic movements, as she mentioned, South Asian, Black American, and Caribbean Islamic traditions and history, and mapping the contours of this history. More than discrete streams that she brings into conversations, Alaina shows us how these unique histories inform one another theologically, intellectually, and organizationally. This allows her to elaborate her notion of a geography of imperial resistance, which she describes as a process by which, quote, Black and Muslim people reimagine their history, belonging, and solidarities through reimagining space and their place in it, end quote. If to forgive my voice, I'm getting over the flu, and I just spent 2 days traveling to Europe, so I'm struggling here. In tracing their efforts to link themselves to a larger global Muslim community, she attends to the diverse, seemingly contradictory character of these movements, which quote, in their economics, gender politics, and politics of respectability could appear quite conservative. Yet in their internationalism, Alaina informs us that their internationalism fosters an anti-colonialist and even radical politics. And I'm thinking here of your treatment in particular of the nation in Bermuda, which I found especially good at showing this, because you help us see how their members, on the one hand, drawn to the nation's conservatism, but joined, even with that conservative inclination, they did join with labor activists, communists, and anti-colonial radicals, as you put it, to attack the racial hierarchies entrenched in Bermudian social and political structures, and as they pursue, quote, a shared vision of Black Bermudian freedom and colonial independence, end quote. So this brings me to the question that I wanted to pose, and it's something of a theological question, I guess, about prophecy. And I don't mean this as an unfair question, as I know you did not take up prophecy as such. So hopefully it makes sense, and I'm not presenting this poorly because I'm not trying to be unfair with that. But in reading your work again, I began to think about Anthony Bogues' discussion of colonial prophecy. And he's talking about uh, things in the Caribbean like Ethiopianism, Obeah, Rastafari, etc., where he argues that colonial prophecy is characterized by claims to divine authority that involve critiques of colonial and racial oppression, as well as the pursuit of social justice. Now, against this, one might think of Eddie Glaude's cautioning us not to lose sight of the undemocratic character of prophecy, by which he means the tendency of prophets not to debate their visions with their followers. I think he maybe overstates it a bit, but that definitely is one pronounced tendency within prophecy. I think James Baldwin gives a much different tint to that story, but neither here nor there. So this was certainly my experience, as I mentioned, with the Church of God in Christ, as well as the Nation of Islam. And again, I know that you did not take up this question, but given your attention to the ability of Black Islamic theology and practice to provide followers a framework, not necessarily for debating their imams, but for understanding and shaping their practices in order to meet their daily needs and confront challenges facing their communities, which suggest a certain flexibility. I just wonder, how would you suggest we think about these approaches to prophecy? Or can we even talk about a Black prophetic tradition within Islam? So just wanting you to maybe with that a little bit, going beyond the specifics, but I think growing out of what you were working on and how you might admittedly help me think through a question that both concerns my classes and a smaller piece on prophecy in Black radical thought. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, you get to answer that one.
Oh, you want me to answer right away? Okay.
If that's okay with you. I mean,
Yeah.
usually like there's the question and then you answer, and then Jennifer will pipe in next with
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Minkah. Thank you. Poor Minkah has had to read this book so much and comment on it so much. So I really do appreciate your interventions and your comments and your provocations and everything. So okay, let me think about this because I did choose not to take up the question of prophecy, like specifically in the book, right? So let me see if I can think through this a little bit. I think that yeah, I mean, all of these people, like there is absolutely like an authoritarian and undemocratic aspect to the way that people are to the way that these leaders operate, right? Every single one of them, there's no room to debate, right? Like their visions, there's no room to debate the history of the organization. Sometimes there's not even room to debate whether or not, right, like you look appropriate or weigh enough or too much or any of those things, right? Like there are like classic stories of like Malcolm X getting out a scale, right? Like in a Nation of Islam meeting and like making people get on it to like fat shame them in front of like everybody, right? Like so, but I do think that much like, and I think that Eula Taylor does this very well, like in her book on patriarchy and the Nation of Islam. I think that one of the things with like that I deal with as an intellectual historian, and I think intellectual historians deal with, is like the inherent contradiction in like the way that people think about things and the way that they execute things, or
Hmm.
how, Black people in these contexts are like, okay, like we are joining this religious tradition and for our freedom, for our liberation, for our like a radical vision of the future, and then at the same time they'll do things like hew themselves to like an extremely authoritarian vision about what the process of getting to that ultimate liberation is, right?
Right.
I just don't I think that like I think that they're contradictory like in certain ways, but I also just feel like for me I'm like everything's got like human thought is contradictory, right? Like everything that's like one of the things that makes it so textured and so nuanced to me. I think that like if I looked at this story and everything just kind of lines up and made perfect sense and everybody was just doing the things that you expected that they would do for their like liberation vision, I don't think I would find it very interesting. Like I tried to write an article about this like actual very happy, uplifting event where like everything went right. And then I realized that I couldn't write it because there was no conflict in it. Like there was nothing to grab onto. And I was like, I don't know what that says about me, but like, I couldn't do it.
Well, I guess maybe one thing I would ask, and
Mhm,
I'll admit that I have a certain hesitancy in following the idea of prophecy, or looking at a prophetic tradition too far down the road. And I think this is because of the very things that you just outlined. But so for the little that I know about Rastafari, if you look at Rastafari, you have in a way where people in the different houses, but then members in those houses might actually look at things a bit differently than how they are supposed to, or how one house or another sees, say, the divinity of Selassie,
mhm,
um, or the use of ganja, right? Um, and one of the things that chapter on Bermuda really got me to think about is, and this is more generally, and I don't think prophecy with its focus on the leader helps us do it, but I'm wondering if this isn't something of what's going on, that they are in a way rethinking and reworking what even if they're drawn to it for some questionable reasons. And I don't think this is anything uniquely particular to Black Islam. I
mm,
definitely know a bunch of people in the Christian church, probably every denomination that joins or pursues it for some nefarious reasons. But there are so many more people who, you know, use it or make adjustments to it in their daily lives or for other kinds of reasons, that I began to wonder, is that something that we should begin to think about in the same way that we think about with the same kind of detail as prophecy?
mhm.
I don't know if that's workable or not, or if it's something that can be. And again, I'm not a religious scholar by any stretch, so I don't
Uh-huh.
know to what extent that even works with looking at, say, members as opposed to leaders. But it seems like that might be something that you could help us think through a bit, if we were to want to go down that road. I don't know if that's possible though.
Right. Yeah, I guess I don't know. What I will say is that like I think that the thing that really like attracted me to the Bermuda chapter, like at first,
Mhm.
like I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. There's a Nation of Islam there. And then I began to like realize that the the Nation of Islam there was just operating in like a completely like it's like, yes, fine, they were accepting, right, that Elijah Muhammad like was a prophet. They were accepting the origin stories. They were accepting like all of this basic stuff, but they were reinterpreting the religion in a way that they would have never been able to get away with had they been on the same continent. right? Like as the main organization. They all would have been exiled. There's no way. I've never heard another story about a Nation of Islam member taking up with communists, labor radicals, throwing Molotov cocktails. Like I've never heard another story. And I feel like if there was another story at this point, I would have heard about it, right? Like, so I think that, I mean, for me, that's a really interesting example because it really does highlight, right, like the ways that people both oftentimes like need to be led, right? Like they need to kind of like have a structure and a framework and somebody to tell them what to do, right? And then within that, right, like I mean, people, I often think about like why I even got into the study of this in the first place. And it's because I'm always thinking like, what do people get out of religion? What does it do for them? Right? Like what kind of power can they get from it? How does it oppress them? Right? Like, so that example for me was really interesting. Like just how are people working through these things, right? Like how are people like exerting like their own power? Um, given like actually like what little power they have, right, in a particular situation. So I just thought that that example for me is just one of the that second half is my favorite part of the, well, I like the whole book. You can't like choose, you know. But
You can choose your favorite child.
yeah, right. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much. Oh man, talk about choosing your favorite child. Now I have to choose my favorite question. Um, um, I'm not sure this is my favorite question, but maybe it does follow from, to some extent, from Minkah's, or at least shows that the book, ways in which the book was similarly generative for me. And that is, I was curious, Alaina, if, so Hubert Harrison makes a very brief showing here twice.
Mhm.
But he shows up enough to have burrowed in my imagination as I was reading the book, because I thought about, for those of you who don't know, Harrison, Jamaican born. No, he's not Jamaican born. What am I saying? He's
Think Crucian.
yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. Makes it to the United States when he's a teen, I think. Am I right? And
Hmm.
becomes known and then unknown, if you will, as sort of the father, or, you know, one of the great intellectual giants of the Harlem Renaissance. And Elaine, as you might know, he had very not nice things to say about Christianity.
Yeah.
Oh, it's fabulous. I can't recommend his writing enough. I mean, he's just a brilliant writer. But on this, he writes, I believe it's in the teens, maybe it's in the 20s, I'm not sure, but about what really bothers him about Christianity is he thinks that is, lo and behold, a slave religion. And that this, so he is in part drawing from Nietzsche, but he's drawing from his own experience and the worry that a slave religion, or sorry, a slave morality also breeds a slave mentality. And so he thinks that that Christianity is particularly dangerous for African Americans or Africans in the diaspora. And as I'm sure many people in the room know better than I do, this is not a criticism that necessarily is going to totally go away, right? We're going to see it again with Malcolm X, I think to some extent with Huey P. Newton and others. And I was wondering then, in what way do you ever see a move among your thinkers that are either turning away from Christianity towards Islam and see Islam as not a religion of slaves? Yeah, so that I mean, one could argue these are all, you know, same thing with Judaism. These are Abrahamic religions, blah, blah, blah. So I guess, I wonder, what was it? Well, one is I wonder among some of your figures whether there is a critique of Christianity that is consistent from one to the next,
Hmm.
and the ways in which Islam was different right, what Islam had to offer that Christianity didn't. And I guess a kind of another question sort of bundled in there, and I apologize, is simply, did you ever see the same sorts of critiques against Christianity marshaled, or sort of anxieties, reluctance around Islam that are similar?
Hold on. Let me just, so wait, let me clarify the last part of the question was just, have I seen critiques against Christianity that are similar to the ones that Harrison is levying, or that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't mean to make it all go back to Harrison, but I'm thinking of a genealogy that is familiar to me, and it predates Harrison. I just know the Harrison is just a figure, right? Chronologically, he tracks
Mhm,
nicely,
mhm,
or at least the beginning. So that the way in which a Black figure, a thinker in your one of these diasporic settings is turning against Christianity, turned off by Christianity, seeing it perhaps among other things, but as a slave religion.
Yeah,
And
so
yeah,
yeah, I think that absolutely, right? Like, so I think that that's like one of the major critiques, right, that you do see genealogically, like in all of these communities, up until we pretty much got to the period where I'm talking about kind of like the Bermudian community, and they're, once they convert to Sunni Islam, at that point they're kind of like, you know what, Christians are fine. Like, it's not for us. Like, Christianity is not for us, but we understand like the value of it and we respect that, right? I think that most of these people see Christianity as brainwashing, as something that slave masters, right, and the Slavocracy forced upon enslaved people to like pacify them, to discipline them, right, like to force them, right, like to like into, right, like a particular like submissive role. And I think that that's also like how part of why, right, like they frame Islam as this, like, they frame Islam like as the counter to that, right? Like, because they say, like, okay, our relationship with Islam predates our relationship with Christianity. Islam was an imperial religion that was the basis for all of these amazing empires in the Middle East, in Africa, right, in all of these places. Right, some of, like, right, like the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam are saying like Islam was our religion when we were, it's like some of this language of when we were kings and queens, right? Like when we were mathematicians, when we were, doing, like important things and not being, right, like chains and coffles and shoved into ships, right? Like, and dehumanized. And I think that I mean, I think that they also recognize, right, that Christianity was a religion that was used to justify that enslavement and that dehumanization, right? Like, so I think that that's part of the way that they see, like, okay, we're going to now, like, we've found this religious tradition that seems to be more indigenous, right? Like, that's indigenous to us, that predates, right, our relationship historically with Christianity. And now we're going to look into that religion for like liberatory potential. And, and one of the things that I don't know, this is, you like write these things and then I'm like, did I put that in the book? I don't remember. But there's like this incident where I don't think I did put it in because I think that it chronologically just fell really far out. But the community that I talk about in Bermuda, I think it was 2005, they petitioned they were part of this study that the government commissioned about whether or not Bermuda should declare independence from the UK. And if they did, it wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, the UK's been trying to get them to be independent for a while, but like Bermuda's like, nah, we're good. Like, we're just gonna like stay here. Um and so they were part of this study. One of the things that they wrote in there, they were one of maybe 3 religious organizations that decided to participate. And one of the things that they wrote in their report was that they believed that Bermuda should be independent because Islam necessitates independence, freedom, and liberation from all forms of oppression, including colonialism. So, I mean, I thought that was like so powerful, for me. Like, I was like, oh, okay, like they're directly saying there's something about Islam. And I do think that, I've had this discussion with other scholars that like study Islam. And I think that I don't know if there is something about the religion specifically, but I do think that the people that practice it believe that there's something about that religion specifically that is particularly liberatory, right? Like, I don't know that I personally can identify what it is, right? I mean, I can identify the same strains in many religious traditions, but I do think the people that practice it and that utilize, I think that they really do believe that there is very special liberatory potential in that particular religion that isn't present in other ones, even though they might respect them, right? Like, they just don't see the same potential. But yeah.
Thanks so much. I guess I want to be mindful of the time. Should I ask one more question, Robeson, or should we pivot? Okay. So Alaina, do you want to take your pick? Let me try this one. So
Okay,
this for those of you who didn't, I know that the Institute had circulated, I believe it was your introduction in chapter 4. So this may be a chapter that some of the folks in the room haven't read, but if you haven't, it's her chapter 6, and I would encourage you to run, do not walk, to your nearest library or bookstore to get the book so you can read her chapter 6, because there's so much in it that is so generative. But one of the things, Alaina, which has really struck me, and I know this is something that you try to do, and I think you do quite effectively in the second half of the book, is to get to the sort of what Ellison called the lower frequencies, if you will, right? So not just the intellectual history or the world views of the big marquee figures, right? But how did some of these ideas make their way into people who normally, we don't have robust intellectual histories. And you've got a lot of that in the second half, but one particular source or set of sources in your chapter 6 was the letters to the final call from prisoners. The one where, I mean, historians should have source envy. I mean, this is just so, they took my breath away how they showed up here. And so I will just say that you've got a footnote that has Ericat's Geographies of Intimacy listed right above Lublin's Geography of Liberation. And I don't know, I haven't had a chance to go back and see, like, what is she doing there? But I thought that was such a perfect connection and, if you will, contrast of what is going on in those letters, right? So these documents from folks who we normally do not have this kind of, such a rich source. And I wondered, either particularly about those sources, where, or maybe you want to comment about other sources where you see that, where like in the source you have both, right? Like a source that kind of confesses the intimacy of someone's interiority, right? The intimacy, if you will, about how they're feeling that they're part of a larger community, a larger we, to various parts of the world, as well as a source of liberation. So I don't know. You could either answer it by just talking about those sources and what they made possible for you, or whether you want to direct us to some other sources. But it seems that you either worked some magic on your sources, or you found sources, I think, that were particularly rich that confessed to these things simultaneously, right?
Well, thank you for that, because I actually didn't even notice that I had put Geographies of Intimacy right next to Geographies of Liberation. But I think that, I mean, and I think that that's so right? Like, is that, I mean, like, people's intimate lives are apps. I mean, people are, the thing is that people are like playing these things, like what people are doing in the first half of the book, and I mean, everything is mixed up, right? It's like, yeah, there's some like acting in the front of the book, then there's like some doing, right? Like there's some doing, there's some acting, there's some thinking, there's some, it's all over the place, right? Like it's not really like a clean break. Like I try to make it seem like it's a clean break for the purpose of the book. But I think that the point is that like all of these things, like all of these ways of thinking about liberation and freedom and enacting liberation and freedom happen both like on a macro level and a micro level. They happen both like at the discursive level, where people are like, we need to like develop like this large liberation framework, this expansive framework. And then there's situations in which people are like, okay, well, how does this apply to my life? And how am I building a community that makes sense to me? And in particular, people think about the Nation of Islam in prison a lot, like people have written a lot about it. And I actually think that your question made me really think about the thing that I think is that people really, the reason that it's so popular, yes, is because I think it does explain a lot of why people are oppressed, and that makes people feel better about their circumstances, right? That it's not all their fault. But I also think people in prison are really lonely. You know what I mean? Like it's a lonely, isolating place to be. You're around people all the time and yet you're disconnected, right? And I think that it's this way of like forging intimate connections with other people, right? Like to have this shared philosophy and this shared way of seeing things. The letters, I mean, the letters, all of the Muhammad Speaks and Final Call newspapers are like such incredibly rich sources, to the point that you could write probably several books just like on those newspapers, like different aspects of it. Like, how are they laid out? What are the letters to the editor like? What are the recipes? I do have an idea for a Nation of Islam cookbook, but I mean, like, but I think that there's like a lot of, there's a lot going on in them. And so I think that, I think that they are really rich sources. And I think that they're devastating sources too, right? I mean, obviously, because they're in the newspaper, they're curated. They're meant to project like a particular view. They're meant to support a particular view that the institution is trying to like push, right? But at the same time, I think that like that's where you see like that tension between like the institutional and the personal, because this is a real person that's writing this. This is a real person. They're a real person that's on death row, right? A real person that's living in the midst of the AIDS crisis in a prison where people are pretending that the AIDS crisis isn't happening, right? Like, and watching people die, right? Like, and being really scared, and then making, right, these connections about oppression and religion, right? Like, and the AIDS crisis and the carceral state, right? And all of these things. And then thinking about how, even though they're never going to get out of prison, right? Like in the case of the death row inmate, right? This person's not ever going to get out of prison. Thinking about how that still doesn't mean that they can't have a fuller life for whatever amount of time they still have left, right? And so I think that the letters are really inspirational. They're devastating. They're disgusting. They're beautiful, right? Like I think that they're like the type of source that really has, that it just has a lot, right, to offer. Like really, I really love that section too. That's like it's one of my favorite. It's hard to pick, like when you work on, when you work on something for as long as you work on one of these books, it's kind of hard to pick like, oh, this one's my favorite. But I think that source is one of my favorite ones.
Thank you.
I want to make sure we are able to allocate enough time for question and answer. So I also want to say, Alaina, Dr. Morgan, incredible work. I feel very, very fortunate to, number one, to be able to read it as well as be able to listen to this exchange. I have questions, but I want to make sure that our guests can ask their questions because I can find you on campus and ask my questions if I need to.
I'm not on campus because I'm on leave,
Oh,
but
lucky
you
you being
can
on leave. Well, then I'll
definitely,
have to find you on the internet and
yeah,
ask.
well, we could definitely grab a coffee or
All right,
something.
awesome.
Yeah.
Esther, I see your Esther, I see your hand is up. And anyone else, please, raise hands and we'll make sure to call you.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm in a coffee shop. I'm on leave with Alaina, actually, and that's why I know about this and her wonderful book, which I'm a proud owner. I've been hearing a lot about this discussion about how Islam gives people in the kind of broad African diaspora a sense of community or a sense of thinking about how they can build solidarity and connections with each other across the Atlantic, across the world. Alaina knows this, but for those of you who don't know, I'm a medieval historian, so I tend to think of Islam in kind of its classical forms and its beginnings. One thing that I didn't hear during the discussion, which I'm hoping that you can maybe expound on, is like where like certain theological aspects of Islam, like how were maybe those deployed in this idea of like solidarity. And I'm thinking more specifically the very, very important concept of the Ummah. And I'm wondering, was that language, the kind of more classical theological language ever used in service of this idea that we can draw connections one to another because there's already a kind of mode of thinking there in classical Islam about how you have to have this like solidarity with your fellow kind of brother or sister in the faith. And of course, this doesn't obviate the fact that Islam over its course had many different kind of fractious movements or anything like that, but that is at its core of its theology. This is not just a religion for Arabs, it's not just a religion for whatever. It's once you submit yourself, you become Muslim. If you're there, you have we're all in this together. So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really interesting, right, is that it's exactly right, like that idea of the Ummah. Like, and I think that when you think about, okay, like what's special about Islam, right, is that it has like all of these like pre-built-in theological, like and sociological, community, cultural concepts, right, that make it actually really easy to take it and then to say, oh, this is a religion that can unite people like all over the world. This is how we built a new geography, right? Like, which makes us into a majority, a powerful majority, and not like a powerless minority that's being oppressed, right? Ummah is not something that the most of the people, with the exception of the Sunni Muslims at the end of the book, that they would use, right? They wouldn't probably use this term. And a lot of the reason for that is especially in the early period, like the early period of like the rejuvenation revival, right, of Islam among Black people, they recognize very much that even though Islam is an indigenous African religious tradition, like I would call it that, right? Like, and that it was practiced, right, like on plantations, that it predates Christianity, that most Black people by the early 20th century have been raised in the Christian church, right? That Christianity is their way of relating to religion. And so they tend to shy away from like terms like that because they think that they believe that they're quite intimidating, right? That like they don't even really use the Quran at the beginning. They use the Bible because that's more familiar. And then as the religion kind of evolves and people become more familiar with it and they've been Muslims for longer and they kind of are learning the history, that's when things like Quranic education begin to enter the picture because there's been enough time and they accept, okay, well, people can handle it now, right? Like people can't handle too much new stuff at once is kind of what they think. But I think that one of the things that has always made Islam very successful is the fact that as an imperial religion, it both adapts the populations that convert to it and it adapts itself to those, right? Like it adapts according to those populations too, right? Like, so I think that it just has a lot of like mechanisms for like internal built-in mechanisms for saying like, okay, like this is a pretty pliable religious tradition. We can have some healthy debates, right, about theology, right? Like about all of these things, right? And that's one of the reasons that I don't necessarily accept like blanket, well, I don't accept blanket condemnations, right, about like the orthodoxy or the heterodoxy of like of any of these religious traditions, because none of us, none of us were like jurists, you know, like I'm not like, you know, none of these people are like, in their condemnations, nobody is like, these are the legal reasons why I think that this is BS, right? Like, so I think that, yeah, so I mean, like, I think that anyway, they're deploying the UMA even without saying that. And that's like a thing that I kind of add, because I think that that's what they're doing, even if they're not saying it, even if they don't have the language to kind of call it that. But I do think that that's part of the appeal of it, is that there's all of these like, you know, little concepts that like make it really easy, right, to say like, oh, I'm gonna be in solidarity with you know, like there's a period where Farrakhan's friends with Gaddafi, right? Like, and he thinks of himself like in solidarity because they're both Muslims. They both want to build a Muslim nation. They both, right? Like, so, yeah.
Other questions? Anyone?
I have a quick follow-up, just a clarification. I'm so, just to be clear, Alaina, did Black Muslims argue that Islam was indigenous to Africa? Obviously, it predates the transatlantic slave trade by quite a bit, but was that the argument? Because I find that so interesting, because it's absolutely not indigenous to Africa. It was like, you know, we can actually track the moment it was
Right.
introduced into the
Well,
African
I
continent.
think that they, I mean, well, I think there's a couple of things, right? Like, like, what does it even mean to be like, right? Like, everything has like a point of origin, a point of entry, a point of, right? Like, so I think it's indigenous in the fact that like, it's indigenous not indigenous to Africa. I call it like an indigenous, like an American indigenous religious tradition, meaning that like it's a part of like African American religious history. Like, it's not, right, like it's one of the religions that was brought with Black people when they made the Middle Passage, right? Like, it's so, I don't know. I think let's talk about it. Let's talk about indigeneity at work. But yeah, I think I don't think that they use that term. Like, I don't think that they would use that term. I think that's probably a term that I used, but I would have to think about that. Yeah.
Arrow, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. If I'm not, my apologies, but did I see your hand up? Or Arrow?
Hi, yes. Sorry, I'm on the move, so no video. But yeah, Alaina, thank you. Really excellent talk and really excellent conversation. Could you say a few words about the kinds of alliances or connections that were foreclosed by this understanding of Islam? And the kind of parallel that I'm thinking about is there's a bit of literature now on the history of Angela Davis in the Soviet Union and the way that, you know, communism, obviously another ideology that was seen as liberatory by a whole lot of people, that was explicitly universal. And you know, and as the Soviet Union turned Angela Davis into this kind of example of American imperialism against communism, it sort of foreclosed some possibilities in Black and Indigenous communities within the Soviet Union to work with Black movements elsewhere, because, of course, not everybody in the Soviet Union experienced communism as liberatory. So I'm wondering whether we can see something similar in the kind of global Muslim community.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, yeah, I mean, like, I think a lot of things were foreclosed. And I think that the weird exception to alliances being foreclosed is the Bermuda chapter, where you see, because right, like being a Black being like adhering to Black nationalism, believing in capitalism, right, and capitalist like accumulation, business ownership, separatism, all of these things does preclude you from like a lot of other potentially liberatory social movements, right? Like the Nation of Islam was not in solidarity with the traditional civil rights movement, right? They did not like Martin Luther King Jr. They called him an Uncle Tom regularly, right? They were not they did not believe in communism, right? Or labor radicalism or any of those things. They were extremely conservative in terms of gender politics. So certainly the women's liberation movement or like the womanist liberation movement would not have been something that they would have forged alliances with. But the interesting part about that, right, is that those alliances were not foreclosed across the board universally in every single place, in every single country, in every single community, right? Like, because the Bermudian example shows, right, that people did have alliances, right? That the Nation of Islam did have alliances with labor radicalists, did have alliances with the Communist Party, did have alliances with their version of the Black Panther Party, which are things that wouldn't have happened. Like those, even though there was an attempt to foreclose those alliances and those solidarities, like people found a way to create the solidarities that mattered to them and that were important to them, right? Now, did that mean that they possibly foreclosed other ones? Probably, right? Like every choice that you make, like every door that you open kind of closes a window, right? Like, so in this sense. So I think that I think that there's always going to be choices that people make that mean that they can't be in solidarity with other people, particularly like when we're dealing with these kinds of ideological frameworks where people oftentimes like collapse a bunch of things together and are contradictory about it. Like the communism example, it's like, okay, great, yeah, communism theoretically like has a lot of things that Black people might be interested in, right? But if you're a Black person in the Soviet Union and you're being like brutalized by the state, right, like then you're not going to, as you said, you're not going to see it that way, right? Like, and so who should Angela Davis have been in solidarity with? Like as a Black person, should she have been in solidarity with, right, with the Soviet Union or the people that were being oppressed in the Soviet Union, right? Like, so I think that, yeah, I mean, like, I think that it's all about, right, like the choices that you make, like you said, and um opening some opportunities, like, is always going to close other opportunities.
I want to give people a chance to continue the conversation. I myself, unfortunately, have to drop off, so I leave it to you all. Or this was just a wonderful conversation, and I just don't want to close it off. If there are more questions to be asked, and kind of, it feels like this is very generative and could kind of keep going, actually. But are we okay to say thank you? Taj, is that all right? You're the moderator, so I want to.
That's perfectly fine. I know we had an end time at 1, and I want to respect people's time, but I also want to say thank you, Dr. Morgan, for this incredible work, as well as to the Institute for convening all of us. And yeah, Really
Well,
appreciate it.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And thank you to Minkah and to Jennifer for your comments. And yeah, I hope I see everybody soon.
Thank you so much. All right, have a wonderful